and as relevant as you can. But yeah, thank you. I am a governor at a school in Devon. I'm a chair of governors at a primary school in Devon. I'm also a trustee on a multi-academy trust where I have the responsibility across the trust for safeguarding. So I think start from the outset by saying I do what most of you do here today. If you're in governance, if you're in clerking, I don't do your job, but you're involved closely with the work that I do. And I think that's important just to stress from the outset that this isn't me telling you what to do. This is me explaining to you how I've had to do some of the things that we're having to increasingly find ourselves doing now, where parental and other complaints are being made about the schools that we work with and support. What I'm going to present to you today isn't directly my own work, and I'm going to stress that because the credit is due to some people who are far, far cleverer than I am in terms of academic research and understanding the psychology of the way people complain. But it has been incredibly helpful to me, and it has made my current role in supporting governors, head teachers, clerks, and so on with dealing with often quite difficult and challenging complaints. It has helped me to help them in my current role. It also helped me in my previous role. And I'll give you a little bit more detail about my background and history that hopefully will make sense of the presentation itself. Charlotte, I know we've talked about trying to get something up on the screen from your end. Are you able to put the first slide up just to reassure me, please, that we've got the IT working? I mean, I can probably do this from my end if we have a plan B, but if we are able to show colleagues the screens at your end, then that is going to be super, super helpful.
Okay,
shall I just give you a moment to get that up and just to make sure we can do that? Okay. So just as Charlotte's doing that, a little bit about me. I spent 31 years down here in Devon and Cornwall, the Devon and Cornwall Police. My final posting, my final command before retiring from the police and moving into the world of school governance was as the head of professional standards. Some of you might be familiar with the sort of work that the professional standards departments in police forces across England and Wales carry out if you've been a watcher of Line of Duty. I don't follow the programme, but I do know enough to know that the easiest way of explaining what I used to do is I am TED, if that makes sense to you. So I ran the department, and the department that I was in command of had two distinct functions. One is the one that effectively forms the basis of Line of Duty, which is the covert anti-corruption functions of professional standards. But the other side that I'm going to talk about much more today is public complaints and customer satisfaction, if you will. And at the time that I was in command of the department, the Home Office was concerned about the increasing number of complaints that were being made by the public about quality of service more than wrongdoing by police officers. There's some very high profile cases that we're all familiar with, sadly, that have made the news about the willful and criminal behaviour of the bad apples that unfortunately have found their way into police services across the country. That is what makes the headlines. The bulk of the work that I managed and oversaw was in fact public complaints, low-level expressions of dissatisfaction, something you'll hear me say several times this morning, low-level complaints made by ordinary, reasonable people in the main. And I'm going to keep referring to this this morning, that the majority of people that we deal with, or I've dealt with and I've helped other schools deal with, have been ordinary, reasonable, normal people who are straightforward and easy to deal with. However, there are others who are less straightforward for us to deal with and can be much more challenging. And the same thing applied in my previous life with the police, where public complaints were concerned. And there should be no surprises in that. We, in education now, and me previously in law enforcement, are delivering broadly a monopoly service to the public who pay for it through their taxation. And increasingly, taxpayers are becoming more discerning and more demanding of the quality of service they receive from their public services. And so it shouldn't come as any surprise that many of the policies and processes for dealing with complaints within the public sector are pretty similar. And there is a read across from police complaints into school complaints. And when I retired from the police service, it struck me that we as governors weren't greatly supported, not through anybody's choosing to leave us unsupported, just the way it was at the time. There wasn't the information out there, there wasn't the support out there to help those of us in governance who from time to time find ourselves allocated a complaint to deal with. So just if the next slide, if you can, Charlotte, please, if you wouldn't mind putting that one up for me. So what I'm going to try and take us through today between now and about 20 past 11, or a little sooner if possible, is how do we now know that broadly we all of us will fit into one of 6 types of complainants. So I'm going to take you through what those 6 different typologies, psychological profiles of complainants look like. How will you then know that if you've been asked by your head teacher or your clerk of governors or your governing board, if you've been asked to lead and investigate a parental complaint, how will you know from today which of the 6 types of person you might possibly now be dealing with? And once you've identified which you think the type of person you're dealing with is, then there are very distinctly different ways of approaching and handling that person according to their profile as to why they've complained. And we want to try and leave you today with some options for how you can then make the best effort to try and resolve that complaint, because ultimately that's what we're all here to try and do, is to resolve that complaint at the lowest appropriate level in a proportionate way with the minimum amount of bureaucracy involved, because often that's all the complainants themselves will want anyway. The importance today, we'll talk about why it's really important to understand the 6 types and why it's important not then to try and mix and match the approach with the complaint that you're dealing with, because often that will fail. And often when I've presented this to other groups, people have said, goodness me, if only I'd known that beforehand, I wouldn't have approached that person in this particular way, because we ended up getting off on the wrong foot, and it made it harder to resolve the complaint. And hopefully this will demystify some of why that happens when we approach complainants without fully appreciating what it is that's behind them and their motivation for complaining. But really importantly, but I'm going to stress again, in the incredibly unlikely and very rare occasions, really importantly, I want to be able to give you confidence that if you find yourself dealing with somebody who is in type 6, and we'll explain a bit more about what type 6 is, you may actually be dealing with someone who is unwell. And in fact, the complaint that they're bringing to you isn't the issue. What the issue for them is something that's going on for them and they need help. And it's important that we have the confidence to be able to call for that help, because it's not for us to resolve their issues, but we do, on a level of humanity, have a responsibility to help somebody who may be unwell. Okay, thank you, Charlotte. So the history lesson continues. These are the incredibly clever people in the University of Victoria in Melbourne that I'm going to give credit to from the outset. So going back about 10 to 12 years, or possibly a little longer ago than that, there was a sense within the community of law enforcement, not just here in the UK, but across the world, there was an emerging concern about atrocities that were being committed that were not associated in any way with terrorism. So these aren't the headline terrorist acts, the lone wolf shootings, the driving of vehicles into crowded places. Park all those cases that sadly we've seen to one side, please, if you will. These were atrocities committed by individuals for whom there didn't appear to be any logical reason as to why somebody who previously had been a normal, ordinary, reasonable person had spiraled downwards in their life to a point where they felt the only way that they were able to draw any attention to their grievance or their complaint was to carry out some sort of atrocity. And as I say, we weren't alone in the UK in experiencing some of these cases, and law enforcement was struggling to understand why that had happened. So the University of Victoria led in work with his worldwide research to try and understand why did those individuals go on that journey that led to that outcome. And that was the plan, to understand why those very, very rare individuals, rare cases, did what they did. As a complete byproduct, a completely unintended outcome of this research was that we are more than just one type of person who could end up becoming what we now call type 6. In fact, there are 5 other fairly recognizable and easily defined profiles of people who raised complaints. And the Home Office, once they were made aware of this piece of research, felt that that was probably key to making improvements for the way in which the police service across the country improved the way it dealt with ordinary, reasonable people with their everyday low-level complaints and low level of expressions of dissatisfaction. Because key to this research was the discovery that most of the people that went on to commit the atrocities in question started out somewhere earlier as ordinary, reasonable people who raised an ordinary low-level expression of dissatisfaction or complaint with a public service. And so this piece of work is much more now about prevention from those ordinary, reasonable people descending to a place where they feel they can and only have one choice, which is to commit an atrocity in order to have their voice heard. We in this country have something, if you put the next slide up, please, Charlotte, we have something in this country already that we already know uses this work, and it's the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre, which is often abbreviated to FTAC. I'm not going to go into great detail about what it does here because there's a significant amount of material available on the internet that if you feel motivated to research it afterwards, you'll easily find a lot of material. It is a department that draws huge criticism from human rights groups and from liberty groups and so on because of the nature and the way that it works. It exists in an anonymous building somewhere in London. It is staffed by psychologists and their support teams from the NHS and also by criminal intelligence researchers from the Metropolitan Police. And the role, in simple terms, the role of the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre is for law enforcement in this country to have the means to manage probably the top 100 most dangerously fixated persons that we have living in our communities. And those are people whose fixation with typically celebrities, politicians, royalty, and other high-profile figures whose fixation is considered to be so dangerous that they need to be very, very carefully managed. And those management techniques, which obviously we're not going to disclose, at any point, are quite intrusive. Hence the reason why there's a lot of criticism and a lot of anxiety in some areas about how appropriate it is to impose restrictions on people's private lives when they haven't actually yet done anything wrong, if that makes it clear. So the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre will deal with people who are in type 6 of the profiling that we find. But regrettably, there is probably many more than 100 in our communities or so people who could potentially be type 6. And so my hope from today is to not to dwell on type 6 and not to make this about the most dangerous people that might be living in our communities. But my hope today is to flag to you that if you think somebody is unwell and maybe has some traits of a type 6 person, that you at least feel knowledgeable and confident enough to be able to get that person some help before they have to be escalated to the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre, where then things have become pretty much out of control for that individual. Okay, could we have the next slide, please, Claire? Thank you. So just as a quick history check, I mean, you may be familiar with some of these cases, but Robert Ashman is a case of somebody who we would now consider to be a type 6 of complainant. He was the individual who had started at the time of his coming to notice of the police, had been a fairly senior manager within, I think it was Severn Trent Water Company, had a very nice large house, had a wife and family, and all the trappings of success that came with being a senior bod within a water company. He became involved in a fairly straightforward minor dispute with the NHS, went into the NHS complaints process as what we would describe a normal, ordinary, reasonable person, an articulate and educated man with no previous convictions for criminality, and felt that the service that he was receiving or not receiving from the NHS was such that he wanted to escalate his complaint. Fast forward, and he became fixated with the NHS. He became fixated with the complaint that he was dealing with, to the extent that his marriage started to break down. At a similar sort of time this was happening, there was a reorganisation within the water company, and his role was changed, and he felt aggrieved by that. Eventually, he was forced to leave the family home and found himself living rough in the bus station in Cheltenham for a period of time. And he took his issues to his local MP and started to be a regular caller at the MP's drop-in surgery. And ultimately, as you may, if you are familiar with this case, he felt that because he wasn't being listened to by anybody, and his employer wasn't interested in him, the NHS weren't interested in him, his wife and family had lost interest in him, he felt his voice wasn't being heard, and so he took himself into the surgery one particular evening with where he concealed a sword, and he attacked the MP and he murdered the MP's assistant. And that was the outcome of his downward spiral. If you could pop the next slide up as well, please, now, thank you. And this is just to illustrate that it's not just based in the UK. This is one of several cases that, in wider law enforcement across Europe, very similar profile. Friedrich Liebacher took himself into the canton parliament in Switzerland and massacred a number of people before killing himself in a protest that had started with a complaint that he had made about not being allowed to ride on a public transport bus because he hadn't presented the right change for the fee or for the ride on the bus. He was asked to leave the bus, felt that was inappropriate, made a complaint to the bus company, and that escalated. And say, long story short, another well-educated, articulate, employed, successful man who no previous involvement with the police, went on a downward spiral that was based upon the fact that he didn't think he was being treated properly when he raised a complaint about the bus company. He was a normal, ordinary, reasonable person, and he ended up in this place, as a result of his downward spiral. And then finally, the one that obviously is particularly relevant to us in school, if you could please, is this individual. Some of you may or may not recognise that photograph. This is Thomas Hamilton, who was responsible for the Dunblane massacre. And again, without labouring the point, another profile of an individual who had no previous contact with the police, who was successful in his businesses, felt that he was unfairly persecuted by the Scouts Association, who suspended him from a period of time while they investigated an allegation against him. And his journey of downward mental health decline involved him writing to the Prime Minister of the day and to the Queen, and pleading with all and sundry for a fair hearing, which he felt he wasn't getting. And so his response to that was to take himself into the primary school in Dunblane, as we know, and carry out the massacre there. Okay, could you just pop that next slide up as well, please, Charlotte? And then we can move on if we can, please. I won't dwell on that tragic incident. Thank you. If you could put the next slide up as well, thank you. So, as I've sort of tried to make clear so far, and I hope if I haven't, I'll just repeat it again. We can't avoid talking about people in type 6 because they are the reason that we know now about types 1 to 5. And it's types 1 to 5 that are of interest to us when we deal with complaints about schools and colleges, because most of the people we deal with will be either type 1 or 2. I did at some point recently focus solely on types 1 and 2 and 6 for a group of people, a group of governors, and then realised, as inevitably you do, that if you skip 3 and 4, and potentially leave people out, people then say, well, why didn't you tell us about those people? So they are included today for just for a complete picture. But I don't really want us to spend a disproportionate amount of time focusing on type 6 because they are incredibly rare and they don't all go on to carry out atrocities, as was profiled by the university in Melbourne. So it's here for a complete picture. But what is really important, and what we have learned, and what we learned through the police service when we implemented this approach to dealing with ordinary, everyday expressions of dissatisfaction, what we learned is that the key factor for affecting the potential for you to have a successful outcome is how you and your organization responds from the very earliest point. And whatever we think of those atrocities, there's a common theme in each of them, that those people started out as ordinary reasonable complainants and just didn't feel they were going to get or were getting a fair hearing when they raised their complaint. And sadly, sometimes people will still feel that, because even if you do follow your school policy and you resolve the complaint, if you're able to the satisfaction of the school and yourselves, and the policy, some people will still be unhappy with the outcome, and that doesn't mean that they're going to turn into type 6 overnight and then carry out an atrocity. But it's worth being aware that people do find it quite difficult to accept sometimes that the complaint they've raised isn't going to go anywhere. And you may well have already experienced this in your schools. Certainly in down here in the West Country, we've seen an explosion of complaints going direct to Ofsted instead of coming through the school to start with. And the DfE complaints review team in Manchester have an uptick in the amount of work that's going to them for review, because people just didn't like the outcome of what has happened at the school level, and yet the school has done absolutely nothing wrong. People just don't like being told they weren't necessarily right on the day. So it is just worth bearing in mind how this can affect people who complain. Okay, so we're going to run through the 6 types of complainant for you. And you're all sitting there now thinking, oh goodness me, I hope I'm a number 1, and that's where I say as a number 1, the normal reasonable complainant. And absolutely we are. The vast majority of us will be normal or ordinary reasonable complainants. There will be some who we would then define as difficult or awkward. There are a group of people who can be defined as being dishonest or more likely litigious in the way that they complain. You will then have some occasionally who are altruistic in their motivation. There are those who do it just for a hobby because it gives them something to do with their time. And then we get this type 6, referred to in the academic work as querulous complainants, but often referred to in school policies and local authority policies as the vexatious, or the persistent, the unreasonably persistent, and all of those terms are interchangeable, and they all generally point towards people who are the most difficult of complaints for you to deal with. But it's also worth remembering, as I said from the outset, that often people who are in type 6 are also unwell, and that needs to be something that we factor into our thinking when we're trying to deal with a complaint. And knowing which of the 6 you're likely to be facing then becomes critical for knowing how you're going to approach them, because there are 6 very different approaches that we take in dealing with them. And before I go on to the more detailed part of that, it just another reminder of something, like, I guess, which is probably fairly obvious to you, is that people don't necessarily exist exclusively in one of these types forever in their lives. That there is the potential for people to move around, and we'll see a little bit more about how that can happen. But there is also the potential for some of the features, some of the traits that feature of one type can also feature in another. And that is just one of those facts that it emerges because we are dealing with people, and people are all different. So we just need to keep ourselves a little bit alive to the potential for there to be some blurring between the categories, or certainly between some of the behaviours. Okay, if we could have a look at the next slide, please, Charlotte. Thank you. So there we go. We will hand this. I know this is a presentation that Charlotte can have and to share afterwards, so you don't have to take this all in necessarily in this session. But we are talking about the normal, ordinary, reasonable people. These are the majority of people who raise complaints about their services, and in this case, if we're talking about schools, they will be genuine people that you can work with, and what they're telling you will be truthful. And often they don't want anything more than an explanation or a quick review of the circumstances, and even nothing more than an apology and the consistent message, please just don't want this to happen again to anybody else, is what we hear a lot from people whose mindset is normal or reasonable. If we look at type 2, if we can, please, Charlotte, thank you. These are people who you'll see this. There are some similarities, not least of which is that you can get a resolution with someone in type 2 as you can in type 1. You're just going to have to work a lot harder if somebody is in a type 2 state of mind. Referred to as difficult or awkward, you may have your own interpretation of what that might mean. If you've dealt with someone who you found to be challenging, perhaps, or difficult or awkward, that's absolutely fine. However, you best remember them. They are honest people. These are not people who are going to fabricate a complaint. These people will bring to you a genuine complaint in the same way that somebody in type 1 would do. But they're doing the difficult or awkward presentation to you is because they probably didn't get the level of service that they probably deserved or thought they should have had when they were in type 1. And the difficulty we face with this is that complaints aren't easy to deal with, and they're not pleasant, and they can have confrontation as part of their nature. And it's very tempting when you're asked to deal with a complaint to put it off and move it down the in tray or down the inbox and delay it, until the next day, because that's going to be easier for you. And I'm going to ask you to do the opposite from today, and that is that there is nothing more important that you can do on the day that you're asked to pick up a complaint than deal with it there and then, because the evidence shows that the sooner we engage and try and address a complaint, the greater the chance of the success of a positive outcome will be. So people who present as difficult or awkward and appear to you to be quite aggressive and angry when they first speak with you, and talk about blame as being part of their concerns now, and wanting some sanctions against an individual or against your organization, which is harsh or unreasonable, and possibly exaggerate the details of the complaint, are doing this because they are already not confident about getting a good service. And if that's the case, it's probably because we didn't give them a great service to start with. There are people who can present from the get-go as difficult or awkward, but it is worth remembering that there's a chance that they're like that now because the response they didn't receive in the first place is what's led them to this state of mind. But we can work with them, and you can get a resolution, which is good. You just have to work a little hard to recover some of the lost ground. I did have a bullet point in this slide previously, which said that grumpy people become grumpier as time passes. And then somebody did point out to me it was rather a clumsy way of explaining the point, and that it could be interpreted that it was a reference to the aging process. So I've taken it out. I didn't mean to infer that grumpy people get older as they get grumpier as they get older. It was that the passage of time will often make a straightforward complaint more challenging to deal with, simply because it wasn't grasped from the outset and addressed. Okay, if we have a look at type 3, please, Charlotte. Thank you. Now, it depends very much on how you deal with these people. It depends on how your organization is structured. The majority of local authority schools, you will be buying into legal services through the local authority's legal department. And if you find yourself dealing with somebody who is litigious, then in Devon, our advice is not to engage with them beyond being courteous and acknowledging receipt of their complaint, but it is to refer any litigious complaint through to the lawyers. In the multi-academy trust world, again, lawyers are available through contractual arrangements that the multi-academy trusts buy in their legal support from whichever legal firm they choose to use. But either way, if at any point there's a sense that in dealing with a complaint and it emerges that somebody's preferred resolution is a compensation or a monetary outcome, then please don't try and negotiate with that. Do seek some legal advice, because there could be some potential pitfalls around why that claim is being made. So you might find in type 3 people are overtly litigious, and from the outset you'll know that because they'll talk about wanting money to resolve the complaint, and the minute that money is mentioned, the red flag is up for you, and often this is the last time that you'll be involved in the complaint, because it needs to go to the lawyers to be investigated and progressed. You might also come across somebody who is dishonest, where the whole of the complaint is a fabrication, where it's false from the outset, and your initial feelings are it's false, and when you start to make a couple of early inquiries, you reach the point where you believe that it is a fabricated complaint. It will have been fabricated for a reason. There's a reason why someone has done that. It might be that they are seeking to to leverage money out of your school or your organization, or it might be they've got an ulterior motive which you won't necessarily see, and that can make it really difficult to deal with, because you're not being given, well, for a start it's a false complaint, but you're not even being given any help to get towards that. So just be aware that it could be tactical, it could be part of a bigger issue that you're not necessarily seeing. But sometimes people go into that state of mind of being dishonest or litigious because, again, they don't believe they were treated appropriately when they were normal, ordinary, reasonable, or even when they were in the awkward state of mind. And the university's research showed that the fabrication of complaints by people is on the journey towards wanting to somehow get their voice heard. So if they don't feel they're being heard, they do something else to try and engage with that organization. And that can either be, well, give me some money, which often does get a response, or even to fabricate complaints. So just to be aware of the motivation around people in type 3 or being dishonest or litigious, and how to address that. If we have a look at type 4, please, if we can. Thank you, Charlotte. The altruistic complaint. These are normal, ordinary, reasonable people. These are genuine. There will be no question of these people being dishonest or being rude or awkward. They certainly want money. But the key to these people in this group is when you have them disclose to you that they're not raising this complaint or this expression of dissatisfaction on their own account, they are doing it for others. So often these are people who like to put themselves forward as spokespersons for group complaints. They are the well-educated, they are often the articulate people who nominate themselves, and often groups will be quite comfortable to allow that to happen. So in the setting of schools, this is the person who puts themselves forward and comes into the school inquiry office and says, I'd like to raise a complaint on behalf of a group of parents who all feel the same about this as either I do, or I'm here to represent them because they've asked me to be their spokesperson. You can work with people in type 4. They're not awkward, they're not unreasonable, they're not dishonest, they're not litigious. They're ordinary, reasonable people, but they have a very distinct motivation, and it's to do something on behalf of others or in the greater good. The difficulty that we face in schools with people in this category is they often want you to be communicating with them and them alone as a single point of contact, which they will articulate as being useful because it saves you sending out lots of emails to lots of other people. And therein is the difficulty that we have around data protection. So in Devon, the advice we give governors is not to communicate with an individual who is altruistic unless it's generic information that doesn't start to talk about individual children or individual members of staff or individual family members. So it's about that data protection and the personal data protection that we have to balance against working with someone who's in this category, because ultimately you can work well with somebody who's motivated to do it on behalf of a group of parents or similar. I have put some advice in towards the end of the presentation around what happens if people in this category take to social media and start to use social media as a platform to air not their grievances, but to air the issue on behalf of others. And there's some useful advice at the end of the presentation, which I won't go into here because you can pick up and research that if you find yourself in that position later. Okay, if we have a quick look at type 5 then, Charlotte, please. So hobby complainants. It's not easy to find an example of a hobby complainant really around schooling. I've struggled sometimes to give a really good example of this, and the best one I can come up with is the people who sometimes it's a bit altruistic as well, but it's about themselves, sometimes complain about parking and drop-off times outside schools at 9:15 and 3:15. I'm unable to see your reaction to that, but I suspect that we're not alone down here in the West Country having the only problem where drop-off time and pick-up time, particularly if it's wet, causes all sorts of traffic chaos outside schools. Hobby complainants can often feature in complaints with lots of other public services. So these are genuine complainants, but they are serial complainers. and they like to involve themselves with other agencies often because it does give themselves something to do with their time. Again, what I mentioned earlier on about not falling into the trap of thinking that people live exclusively in their own type complainant types, and this is another example of that, because serial complainers who are defined, one of the definitions of a serial complainer is also within the hobby complainant, but the type 6 people can also be serial complainers. And so that's the first example of just bearing in mind that the lines can sometimes blur. Okay, if we have a look at type 6, then please, thank you. There's a lot of information here about type 6 because there's a lot to consider, but that isn't to be taken as meaning that this is going to happen in your school or to you as a governor if you're asked to investigate one. Type 6s are incredibly rare, as I said earlier on. I will give you a case study in a few minutes of the only one that I've dealt with in the last 20 plus years who fits this profile. But it would be wrong not to go through this in detail with you, such that you have then the information at your hand to deal with somebody and help somebody who might be in this kind of state of mind. So rare, but massively time consuming. These people will eat up huge amounts of your time if you're if you're doing it as a governor. If you're doing it as a member of staff at school, you're just not going to get to your day job if you get involved in someone of this type. They are very time consuming. They are vindictive people, and they will present as vindictive people, and the sort of language that you can expect them to be using is going to be vengeful. And it will be very unreasonable, and they will make unreasonable demands of you, and as you see here, make multiple complaints involving multiple agencies. But so do people in type 5. They do that as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people in type 5 are going to become type 6. It's just an example of how we have to keep an open mind about the definitions. If you talk to somebody and have a conversation with somebody in type 6 state of mind, they will be unreasonable in every way. And I've been asked before to give examples of what is unreasonable, what would unreasonable include, and it is whatever is unreasonable to you. So if you're limited really only by your own threshold and tolerance for unreasonable behaviour. Asking for £1 million every day of the week until this complaint is resolved. I've got no evidence that's actually happened, but that's a kind of an unreasonable. You'd know if it's unreasonable. It will feel unreasonable from the outset, and you're not there to be the subject of unreasonable demands and to be delivering things which are simply not going to happen. The difficulty you have is you're working up with somebody who is cannot negotiate with you and or compromise with you. It's not that they are refusing to do it or they're choosing not to. They simply do not have the state of mind that enables them to negotiate or to compromise. They cannot see any common ground. They can't look for pragmatism in anything that you might try and help them with. And therein lies, I think, one of the biggest problems we face in those of us that have chosen to volunteer and support children in schools and those that work in schools. I think we all share, we do share lots of common values, but one of the things that we all share is that we're all pretty good at solving problems. We're all pretty good in some way or other at making things better for children and young people and improving their life chances. And we've got a toolkit at our disposal that we know works really well when it comes to problem solving. And that is our Achilles heel when you're dealing with somebody in type 6, because you're dealing with somebody who doesn't want you to fix the problem. So from the outset, having a great problem solving approach, having a great track record of solving problems and being someone who can fix things and make it better with a degree of negotiation, compromise, pragmatism, call it what you will, we're doomed from the outset, because we're up against someone who fundamentally doesn't want you to succeed. Because what they don't want a resolution to this complaint. They actually want the complaint to persist. So if you start to home in on a potential resolution, and there's a sense in their mind that you might be getting towards an outcome and a conclusion that will draw a line under their complaint, they will react very adversely to that in a number of different ways, one of which is to reframe the complaint. or to change the complaint, or to allow you to resolve that complaint and then immediately raise another one to give, again, new life to something which they don't want a resolution towards. So you can see why time is going to be eaten up very, very quickly if you start to get involved with someone who is in this state of mind, and you think that you're going to bring your fine skills of problem solving to bear, because it simply won't work. If you could move on to the next slide again, please. Thank you, Claire. Thank you. So often the first thing that you'll know about somebody who's in type 6 state of mind won't be a personal conversation or a telephone call. It will be the receipt of a significant email of complaint, a letter of complaint potentially, which from the outset will be extensive in its presentation. So the example I use for here is there was a small primary school in East Devon that I assisted probably about 10 years ago now, where the head teacher contacted me through government services and said, I've got this very unreasonable letter of complaint. It doesn't even involve the child of the family who have complained, and I can't see a connection between why they've complained. This complainant has raised this issue and the child in question. Could you come to school and could we go through it together? And I thought that was a bit unusual, that we would need to discuss a letter that we could perhaps discuss over the telephone. However, I went to the school and we had a meeting, and the letter was in fact contained in an A4 lever arch folder, which had been presented in the school by the complainant, and it ran to 275 pages of double-sided A4 as a letter of complaint, wholly excessive and irrelevant. But in the mind of the person who raised the complaint, that was their complaint. And their demand of the head teacher was, I want you to read this and resolve this complaint for me, or I'll take it further. So we started to have a look at it, and a lot of the material that was within the folder was simply copied and pasted and taken from textbooks and from newspaper articles and from the internet as it was then, and so on, and just put together in an incoherent and an aggressive way, but never actually really defined the nature of the complaint. And without that, you can't deal with it. That's unreasonable. It's unreasonable to give a governor 275 plus pages of complaint and expect them to deal with it. So you have to be, we'll come on to how to deal with those later on, you have to be quite clear in how you're going to respond to that. So a folder of that size, or email nowadays, I guess, rather than necessarily a paper copy, but certainly an extensive, lengthy email or attachments to emails, which don't really give you any clue as to what you're dealing with, are a really strong sign that you might be up against somebody who is in a type 6 state of mind. So watch for that as a clue. Also be aware of anything where there's a proposed conspiracy theory within the letter. Ashman and Leabacker, when their cases were reviewed by the university, they were riddled with references to agencies being in conspiracy with each other, the government being involved, that there were dark forces at work to try and silence their complaints. You know, it might seem quite improbable when we talk about it here this morning, but these things have happened, and they have helped us to learn a little bit more about why people complain and how to identify them. You're not there to be responding to anything that's rude or confrontational or threatening. Governors, head teachers, clerks of governing boards, it's not our job, it's not your job to dialogue with people who write rude, confrontational, threatening letters to us. The situation with the 275 page letter, when we didn't read it in detail, but when we scanned through it, there were threats within that to what the individual was going to do if he didn't get satisfaction. And the way in which we addressed that complaint was to write back to the complainant on the same day with a letter that simply said, thank you for bringing in your folder. We are not in a position where we are able to read that folder because of the volume of the material that you've submitted. However, if you are prepared to condense your complaint into no more than 2 sides of A4 and to send that back into school within 5 working days, we will consider where we go with your complaint. The individual who made the complaint wrote back and said that was unreasonable on our part, and that it was our job to read the letter and to deal with the 275 pages. We filed our letter and didn't do anything about his complaint. It did trigger inevitably a contact by the individual with Ofsted, and the complaint was directed against me for advising the head teacher unprofessionally and erroneously about how to deal with that complaint. I'm still waiting at the moment for an outcome from Ofsted as to whether or not they felt that I acted unreasonably. But as that was in 2014, I'm guessing they probably aren't going to be writing to me anytime soon. But you have to be as blunt and robust as that when it comes to dealing with somebody in this category, or you will lose enormous amounts of time and effort in trying to resolve something for which this individual never actually wants a resolution. Okay, could we just move on if we can, please? Thank you, Claire. So if you and this is the real dilemma I'm finding now with this, the last 3 or 4 months, we've seen an uptick in the number of ordinary, reasonable complaints that have been made by parents where the letter of complaint or the email of complaint or the way in which they've tendered the complaint has been drafted for them by AI. And AI is giving people an opportunity to present complaints in a very different way than we've seen over the past 15, 20 odd years. I'm yet to see an example of a type 6 who has used AI, because they're rare in numbers, but it can only be a matter of time. And somebody here listening today may even have already been in receipt of a type 6 complaint that the complainant has used AI to frame for them. My worry is that if somebody is in type 6 and they have the time to write 275 pages and print it off and put it in a lever arch folder, with all the time that must have taken, if you imagine how quickly AI could do that and how many pages AI would generate, it can only be higher than those we've seen in the past. However, the style and the giveaways of the way in which a type 6 person thinks and presents themselves in their paperwork when they put a complaint in is probably not going to go away, because they do like to exercise control over the organization that they are dealing with. They do like to personalize and be threatening towards individuals, which is beyond AI's ability, because AI will be quite generic in putting together a letter. And so I anticipate that we will see AI being used by type 6 people, but they will still find it very difficult to resist the temptation to personalize it. And you'll see from this particular slide the sort of giveaways that you either may have already seen or might see in the future where somebody is in type 6 state of mind. So lots of use of bold font, underlining keywords, quotation marks used extensively, italicizing sections of the text, and then using language that, as I said here, is to obfuscate you with stenographic verbosity. And I'll say often running into tens of pages of appendices and so on, and attachments and references that they expect you to go and look up, and then tell you that they want you to reply to them within 48 hours with your full response. So there we go. So AI, yeah, watch out for AI. I think it's going to be an emerging trend that we're going to see across the piece, not just with type 6s, but also in ordinary complaints. If you do get involved in dialogue, if you have a meeting with them, don't meet them alone. If you have a telephone conversation with them, be prepared to lose a lot of time. They are very persistent on the phone, very difficult people to draw an end to a conversation with. And of course, if you go to the nuclear option, as it were, and just put the phone down in order to end that conversation, which I think sometimes is the only choice, it is likely that that will then in itself generate another complaint, because they will always look for an opportunity to bring a fresh complaint forward or to add to an existing complaint, because, as I said from the outset, their goal is not resolution. Their goal is to perpetuate the complaint. When I was a head of police complaints in Devon and Cornwall here, when I first went into the department, took over from my outgoing colleague, he briefed me on an ongoing complaint which was contained within a couple of big box folders of material. And he said, this is a complaint which we're struggling to try and resolve. And he said, it's been decided that it sits best with the head of department to monitor it, and rather than to try and put any resource to it, but it is an unresolved complaint. And he gave that to me as I went into the office. And I, like you do, said to myself, I'm going to be the boss of the department that makes sure that this complaint is resolved. So I started reading through the material and then quickly realized how extensive the complaint was. And I have to say, regrettably, when I left the department and moved on to retirement, I handed that box to my successor 6 years later, still unresolved. That, when I left, was the longest running complaint Devon and Cornwall Police were dealing with, and it was 26 years old. And it was exploited a loophole in the Home Office guidance on police complaints, which allows a complainant to conclude their letter with something on the lines of, I reserve my right to make this complaint formal in due course. And what we've been doing for 20 plus years was writing letters backwards and forwards, seeking confirmation from the individual they wanted to make a formal complaint that we can investigate, only to get back a reply that said, I haven't made my mind up yet, but until I do, you'll have to keep my complaint open. And of course, that's what we had to do. So, and just to complete the picture, that was a dispute that had started between two neighbours over one neighbour having a cockerel that was noisy in the morning when the sun rose. So when you get involved in these things, you can see if someone is in that state of mind where they want to perpetuate a complaint, they can perpetuate it for years, unless your policy allows you an off-ramp, as they seem to say at the moment, to be able to close it down much sooner than that. Okay, could we move on, please, Claire? Thank you. So again, just to help you out here, this is not an exhaustive list. It's just some of the things that you might want to consider about what is an unreasonable behaviour type. So being rude, disorganized information in huge quantity. I think we've covered that. Changing and reframing the complaint. It's not reasonable. If you deal with a complaint that's been brought to you and you deal with it appropriately and in line with your policy, it is not reasonable for the person to say to you when you're 2/3 of the way through, oh, by the way, I want to change my complaint, please. That's not what you were asked to look into. That's not reasonable behaviour. Telling you how you will deal with the complaint, so putting time frames on you, demanding who you will speak to, demanding that you will follow lines of inquiry that the complainant wants you to follow, which aren't relevant, being unreasonably persistent. All those sorts of behaviours, as I said earlier on, that you might think are unreasonable will be unreasonable if that's what you think they are. And this is just an illustration of the sorts of things you might want to have to consider. Could you pop us on the next slide, please, Claire? Yeah, thank you. So I think at that point, I know we said earlier today that there wouldn't be time for questions now, and there isn't now, but please do, if you want them to ask them later on, bring them to the session later, and I'll try and, if we have the time, to deal with them for you. But this session might help you out. So we'll now look at how do we actually deal with each type. So going back to the beginning of type 1s again, if we just have the next slide, please. You'll see here I've underlined move quickly. I have to say that moving quickly is probably the strongest and the most powerful of the tools you'll have in the toolbox for getting a successful outcome to a complaint. And certainly with somebody who is reasonable, moving quickly will work every time, because that's a reasonable thing to do and they're reasonable people. Ask them what good looks like. What do they want to happen at the end of this complaint? If they could have a magic wand and wave it over the problem they've just brought to you, what do they think good would look like at the end of it? Because if you can establish that really quickly and early on, you're likely to find a resolution that meets with their needs and can comply with your school's policy, and everyone can be quite content. And let's not forget, we're talking here today about those low-level expressions of dissatisfaction, low-level concerns. If this was an allegation of misconduct by a member of staff, then we wouldn't be even touching the policy for complaints. We would have to refer through the HR processes and the employment law processes, because an allegation of misconduct or anything more serious is a formal process that is governed by legislation. So we're right at the bottom of the scale here in terms of what people feel aggrieved by. It's low-level, ordinary, everyday complaints or expressions of dissatisfaction that just concern people. And so ask them from the outset, are you wanting to is this a formal complaint about someone's conduct? Is this a formal complaint that you need to raise, or could we deal with it quite adequately in terms of a couple of conversations with some key people? I'll make some inquiries and come back to you and let you know what the outset is. And if it's an apology, we'll go with an apology. And they will tell you, an ordinary reasonable people will say from get-go whether they think it's a formal investigation that's required, because it involves something that might result in a sanction for a member of staff. And if it does, then we need to engage with HR anyway, and this becomes, irrelevant. The motivation for the complaint is still important, but the process changes dramatically as soon as it becomes something that's formal. If you're able to meet with them speedily, face-to-face is best. Think about potentially neutral location if it's necessary. If they're a little bit worried about coming into school because they don't feel it's necessarily going to make them feel comfortable, just try and arrange to meet them somewhere else if we can. Do anything that's within your reasonable power to resolve this for the ordinary, reasonable person. And saying sorry that they've had to raise a complaint is okay. I do think sometimes we get a bit drawn into the world of insurance companies and not admitting liability and so on. But these are low-level complaints or dissatisfaction. If it's wrong and we were wrong and we need to apologise, let's apologise, and let's be decent about that and do that. And do, of course, as I will see in each of these slides, you'll see the same thing. I repeat this. Do please of what happened and what you did for the archive for the future in case it ever needs to be revisited. Okay, if we have a look at type 2, how do you deal with those? Again, you'll see I've underlined move quickly. Even more important if they're awkward or difficult, because they could be awkward or difficult because they haven't had a rapid response to when they first made the complaint. Be clear about what the outcome is going to include. Because these people now are getting grumpy and they're expecting things to be different because they've become a bit more aggressive towards you. It doesn't mean that you can do anything more to meet that expectation by changing what you would do with a sanction. If the sanction is not available, it's not available. Whether they are happy with that or not, it remains to be seen. If we've got something wrong, and it's obvious that we've got something wrong and there's a need to accept blame, then be confident to only accept it in a measured way, because these people will already now be wanting to try and make themselves more of a victim than they perhaps were when they were in type 1. And if you think there's an element or parts of the complaint which are, this isn't about false complaints, this is now about exaggeration. If you think that what they complain about, as they say, has happened 3 times, and your view and your senses or even your evidence is it only happened once, then do challenge that, because often what people who are in a state of mind in type 2 will do is exaggerate, not in a false way, but just over egging it to try and grab attention. So be confident if you need to be, and you know that that's not the number of times is not what they state, to push back on that. And again, if you think an apology is appropriate, I'm always a fan of saying sorry if we've got it wrong, and produce another summary or a written report for the archive again on that type. Thank you. Okay, type 3. So I think I covered this earlier on. If there's any sense that this is about money and the only way that the complaint is going to go away is because you get the school checkbook out, then don't get involved. Please seek legal advice from the outset, because litigation is not what we expect governors and head teachers and clerks to be involved with. We contract or pay other services to look after us when it comes to any litigation. And again, if it is a false complaint and it's patently false, you need to push back at that and say so. We just challenge if this is a fabricated complaint, particularly if it's fabricated around any of our members of staff, because that's not fair, it's not appropriate. And we need to push back if we can demonstrate that we know that this is a false complaint. Okay, type 4. I think we probably covered type 4 reasonably earlier on. The challenge, like as I said, is around data protection, but it is worth investing time in the relationship with dealing with somebody who is altruistic, because they can actually be really helpful, particularly if they're reasonable people themselves, which they should be, because that's their typology. They will want a written report. There's no good saying I'll do, and they'll want a written report because they'll want something to show and share with the group that they're representing. So that written report needs to be carefully constructed and avoid any disclosure of personal data. But these people are motivated by wanting to do this on behalf of others, so that they will need something to take back to the group. And this is where, if you can engage well with the altruistic complainants, you stand a good chance of keeping this off social media, because you can work with someone in type 4 quite effectively, and you can set out to them that it wouldn't be helpful for it to be discussed on social media in the wider community, because that would potentially compromise what you're trying to do to resolve the complaint. But they will come back to you and say, well, of course, I shall need a report at the end of this to share with the group in that case. And that's okay, provided that report is isn't going to breach anybody's rights under data protection law. Okay, if we look at type 5, briefly, if we can, please, again, respond promptly. Don't get drawn into their wider complaints history. They will try and hobby complaints will try and link up complaints across agencies, which is the sort of behaviour we also see with type 6s as well, when they want to exaggerate their complaints and bring in other conspiracy theories. So avoid being drawn into that. Stick only to what the school or the college or your organisation can deal with. There will be other things happening, and they may be true. There's nothing dishonest about someone in type 5, but it's not for us to be drawn into wider complaints. And it's important, as I said there, that you are clear on what you can do, what's within your gift to do for a hobby complainant. And they will again be people who will expect and probably tell you that they expect a written report at the end of what you've done. That needn't be lengthy, particularly if there's not a lot that we can do, but it needs to be controlled quite well. Otherwise, you just end up spending more time trying to deal with someone whose hobby is to make complaints, and we have better things to be doing than servicing their hobbies. Okay, and then if we look again at type 6, promptly again is important, but really control this. You have to be really controlling with what you're going to do if you're going to deal with someone in type 6. They will know intimately. If not, they'll probably have gone into word for word level of detail with your policy. They will know your policy inside out. They'll know the guidance. They'll know the DfE guidance. They make it their business to research what organisations can do before they engage with them, and that's part of them wanting to maintain the control over you as the investigator or the governor, or whichever role you're in. They want to control you, so they will make it clear to you that they know more than you do about your own policy. Advice here about avoid the temptation to resolve the complainant. You can't begin to fix the things that could be going on in the lives of people who are in type 6. They are complex and often, as I mentioned earlier, unwell, and with the best will in the world, that is not our role to resolve it. It's our role to try and resolve the complaint, and if we can, we will. If we can't, we won't, and it's unlikely to resolve it because they don't want it resolved. Our responsibility in this situation is to get help for the person who needs the help to resolve what's going on in their lives for them, because the complaint that they brought to school is a mere symptom of something much larger. And being really firm. If the matter is not for further investigation, and you're going to write a letter that says this school will not be pursuing this complaint because it is baseless and the matter is closed, that's what we have to mean. We have to stick to that point, because if you row back from that position, they will exploit that. They'll see that as a vulnerability, and you'll have a huge subsequent complaint that will come in of something else, and you'll go back around that loop again of trying to resolve something that they don't want a resolution towards. And if you've been reasonable and you've got to the point where you said to someone in type 6, we are closing this matter down, they will write back to you. They will do that. It's inevitable. When that letter is received, the reasonable thing to do is to acknowledge receipt and simply say, thank you for your letter of the 15th. It's been placed on the file. And that has to be the end of the matter. And the reason I sort of suggest that that's something that's good to do is because if the DfE do decide to have a look at the way in which the school has handled this complainant, one of the things the DfE are keen to see is that at every stage of the process, regardless of whoever type of complaint you're dealing with, that every stage of the process, the school has been courteous and respectful and acted reasonably. And if you can demonstrate that, the DfE will be on your side in the way in which you've tried to manage this particular complaint, because they know themselves up in Manchester what these people can be like when it comes to being difficult complainants to deal with. Okay, and the next one, please, if we can, Claire. Thank you. Yeah, so if you get a really lengthy complaint, I think I've covered this point already for you. Just reject it and say, please send it back in a much more reasonable and concise way, and we will consider it. You do not have to correspond with anybody who writes you an intemperate or rude or threatening letter. I mean, there are courses of action that we can take, particularly where threats are concerned, and if those threats are serious and are likely to be followed up, then we need to think about engaging, with other agencies, with law enforcement and with the local authority and so on to safeguard ourselves. But we're not there. You're not there. You're not a school governor to respond and deal with the rudeness that can often follow with people who are type 6 when they write letters to emails into school. And there's an example of a school that received 40 emails overnight in the admin inbox, much of the same type from the same person. I would not expect anybody to sit down and read through and respond to 40 intemperate, unreasonable emails overnight. But the person that will have written them will have said they want to reply by the end of the school day. It's not reasonable. Don't do it. And you're dealing, as I said earlier on, with someone who wants no resolution. So all those skills that we know that we use to problem solve are futile when it comes to this person, because they don't want you to actually ever get to that resolution. And the point here, their behavior towards you and your school is not the problem. Their problem is the problem, and that's what's behind what's motivating people in type 6. And there's that research from the university in Australia found time after time that organizations had complaints policies in processes in place. Some organizations have large departments for dealing with complaints, and those departments did what they could do, but nobody's thought beyond that as to why was the person behaving in this way. And it's that learning that we want to share now to help somebody who might, as I said earlier on, who might actually be ill. Okay, could we have the next slide up, please, if you don't mind? Thank you. So why is it important to control someone who's type 6? Because you may well be dealing with someone who is going through a psychotic episode and be really unwell, and they might need help. And the research showed that these people started off as ordinary, reasonable complainants. They became socially isolated. Where they did have lawyers, they dismissed them as being ineffective and went on to try and represent themselves. They were almost to a type. Every one of the case studies were educated and articulate people who went on a downward spiral and whose behavior became less and less rational throughout, and got to that position where they were driven and motivated by keeping their complaint alive, as it were, because that got them the attention that they felt they wanted. And it was when that didn't ultimately result in anyone listening to them that we know that they went on to do things that were atrocities. Okay, thank you. Could you put the next slide up, please, Claire? Thank you very much. So I've got a bit of a case study here for you that this really happen at my school. And this isn't, again, about sending you away from today's conference with undue worries. I don't want anyone to stop being a governor because of what they've heard today. I'd be heartbroken if I thought I'd done that. But does it happen at a school? Could it happen at a school? It does. It's happened once to me in one school only in the last, say, 10 to 12 years. So it is rare. And in this particular case, this was a parental complaint. It began because in fact, it was a grandparent who wanted the school to amend the list of contacts for a child in the school should the child be unwell at school, and should we need to contact a parent during the school day. The grandparent wanted the list changed to put themselves as the number 1 point of contact rather than the number 3. So it wasn't to be included where they weren't, it was simply to move up the priority call out list at the expense of one of the parents who was number 1. This was because the parents were going through a divorce, and the grandfather felt that it was in the child's interest and support of his own grown-up child that he became the first on the call out list. The school declined to do that because there was no case for doing so, and the grandfather was already a contact on the list in any way, and that escalated into an out of control situation where there were threats of violence towards members of staff by the grandfather, both outside the school. He lived very close to the school grounds, so both outside the school and on school grounds. He was, for a period of time, banned from the school as a result, using the local authorities' policy because of his behaviour. And when he then put the complaint into the head teacher, there were attempts made to resolve it, and he then changed the nature of the complaint, began to get quite threatening as to what he was going to do, involving other organisations and social media. Huge amount of paperwork was created, and ultimately, after he was banned, I was asked if I could support the school in trying to deal with how we go forwards with this man's behaviour. And all the signs to me were there of someone who was in type 6. We had a multi-agency case conference arranged by the local authority involving the diocese. This was a church primary school, and additional safety measures were put into place at school for the children. And thankfully, we got as far then. We got through to the end of the summer holidays in July with nothing happening. But there was always a sense that he had the potential to do something extreme, and in fact that's what he ended up doing. On the first day of term in September, he had driven to the road in which the school was located, and he waited at first thing in the morning until our school caretaker at the time unlocked the gates for the first day of term, and he then accelerated his car and ran over the school caretaker. Thankfully, didn't cause him any serious injury, but it resulted in, obviously, he was arrested and prosecuted, and a term of imprisonment. And that was him demonstrating his type 6 behaviour. No one would listen to me. No one would move me up the list from number 3 to number 1. I'm going to do something that people will notice and recognise, and perhaps then they'll deal with my complaint. So that was the scenario. If you put the next slide, if you wouldn't mind, thank you, and just pop them up as you can, because I'm conscious of time here as well at the moment. This was the profile of the guy. He was articulate and well-educated, man of faith, previously had a job with the Department of Education, and this one that really surprised me, he'd been a school governor. But by the time this complaint had deteriorated to the level it was at, he saw conspiracy. He had multiple parallel complaints against other agencies. Well, don't forget type 5s do that as well, but it doesn't necessarily mean they'll turn to type 6. And he was unwell. He was really unwell, and he ended up with a diagnosis of PTSD. And again, it would be inappropriate to go into the detail as to why he had that diagnosis and what had caused that. I know what caused his PTSD, and I completely understand how a man of his profile went on such a downward spiral against all the things that you would otherwise think would stop a man from behaving that way. It didn't. And he was clearly unwell and needed help. However, I have put into this presentation for you just one page of, this was one of a 9-page letter of many, many letters that just give you an idea of what a letter from a type 6 can look like in the way it is written. So you'll see the bold and you'll see the underlining. I have changed the names, of course, in this case for everyone concerned. But if I just give you a moment, it is in the presentation afterwards anyway, but I'll just give you a moment to have a quick read through what he actually says, as well as the way it's written. You'll get a feel for what a type 6 letter could look like. Okay, I think that's, I must say, it is in the handout, or the presentation for later on if you want to use it, and I'm happy for you to share it just to help others to understand what you might be looking at if you find yourself getting an email or a letter of this type. As I say, that was one page of a 9-page letter, and there were hundreds of letters of this type written to the school, often multiple times a day. Um, and so that all the signs were there, and regrettably he did go on to do something which we all wish we could have foreseen. It's impossible to foresee how they'll behave. um, I mean, measures were put in place to try and minimize the risk, but he still found a way of doing something atrocious in the cause of what he thought was the right thing to do. But I'm going to say again, very, very rare. The only one that I've ever come across, and if you've got any examples that you'd like me to, to have a look at afterwards, because you think you've got something like this, then please do get in touch, and we'll talk it through, because I'm here to try and help and assist. So really, in conclusion, if you can understand which of the which of the 6 types you're facing, you will stand a much better chance of resolving a complaint if you're asked to deal with one. I'm guessing today there's probably 149 people on at the moment, according to the screen here, Charlotte. And so probably 149 people are not going to be putting themselves forward to deal with a complaint after today, and that's understandable. But if you find yourself having to deal with a complaint, I hopefully give you some options. You can have an appreciation as to why the 6 different types need 6 different approaches to be taken in order to try and maximize the chance of getting a resolution. In all cases, please, do follow school policy, MAP policy. Sticking to process and policy is critical, because one of the things that these complainants will sometimes do if they're not satisfied is escalate the complaint, and they can escalate it to the DfE complaints department in Manchester. Unfortunately, a lot of the complainants are disappointed when they escalate it, because they don't fully appreciate that the role of the DfE complaints department in Manchester isn't to overturn the decision that the governors may have made about a complaint. It's the role of the DfE to make sure the governors have followed their policy, that they've acted proportionately, that they've had a process, and that they haven't set or broken a precedent. And if the DfE can see your correspondence and your report and your emails, and throughout there is a sense of courtesy and respect and reasonable behaviour, reasonable conduct on behalf of the school, and that each point throughout the process the school has followed its policy, the DfE will support you, and will write back to the complainant and say, we're not prepared to intervene because the school has followed its policy and process. So it is absolutely vital to stick to your policy and process throughout. But please also, just if you can, just bear in mind, if you feel you've got someone who's in type 6 and you feel they're unwell, forget trying to deal with the complaint, because they don't want a resolution. Let's put the humanity back into it. Let's see if we can be the agency that helps get that person some help. And then the bit that I'll end on for now, because I'm all that stands between you and your coffee now, is that if you have a situation where the person in front of you, or the person you're dealing with, or the person that the school is aware of, has the type 6 traits and is presenting in that way, and they are a parent or carer, then you have to start thinking about safeguarding. Because if there are children living with someone who is having a psychotic episode and behaving that way, then we're aware of that. We have to think about what that might be like for that child or children to be living in a home with someone who is that unwell. And that might sound a little controversial. It might be a bit, beyond, you might think it's a bit beyond our remit as governors, but safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And if we've seen the signs here of something, we need to be that organisation that is confident enough to join up those dots, because those cases that were reviewed by Melbourne time after time, and the Thomas Hamilton one is, if you read the file, if you read the report on the Dunblane massacre by Lord Cullen, if you read through that, time after time, the clues were there, but no one agency felt it was their responsibility to actually stand up and say, I'm going to put the flare up on this one. And I think we have to, if we learned nothing else, it's that the complaint that the person's raised is actually neither here nor there. The issue is for the safety of them and the safety of any children they may be living with, because that would be wholly wrong for us to overlook that if that were to happen. So please just bear that one in mind as well. Okay, I think, Claire, from memory, this is the end of the presentation. There are references here to some of the material we've covered today. Could you pop the next slide up, please, if you don't mind? The very last one. That's it. That's the one. So I mentioned earlier on, there's some information available to you if you feel that complainants are taking things out onto social media. What you can do to support your staff and yourselves and protect yourselves from the campaign going viral, as they call it. So I put these links in, which I think, if you do have to use them, you might find helpful. But similarly, if at any point you want to pick up the phone or have a chat about any of what we've talked about today, do get hold of me through Charlotte, and we can have a one-to-one if necessary.